It's not every day that the son of a world leader finds himself at the center of a political firestorm. But then again, nothing about Donald Trump's presidency was ordinary. From the moment he stepped into the political arena, he was a disruptor, a force that defied expectations and shattered conventions. Every decision he made, every word he spoke, was met with an avalanche of reactions, some in admiration, others in outrage. Yet, through it all, there was one part of his life that he always sought to keep out of the relentless media circus: his youngest son, Barron Trump. But the media had different plans. For years, the press had dissected every aspect of the Trump family, searching for weak spots, attempting to use his loved ones as a way to chip away at his larger-than-life persona. Unlike other presidential children who were largely left alone by the press, Barron was different. He was a Trump, and that meant he was fair game, or so they thought. But what happened when the media tried to use him as a pawn in their endless attacks against his father? No one expected the response that came next. If you believe in leadership, power, and second chances, this is the place for you. Hit that like button, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to never miss an inspiring Trump story. It was supposed to be just another press event, another opportunity for journalists to push their agenda, to frame Donald Trump in the way they wanted. They came prepared, their questions sharpened, like daggers, their goal clear: to provoke, to discredit, to humiliate. But they made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed that Barron Trump was just a quiet observer, a passive presence standing beside his father. What they didn't realize was that he had been watching, listening, learning. And when the moment arrived, when they thought they had the perfect opportunity to strike, Barron Trump did something that left the entire room stunned. His response wasn't just unexpected, it was a masterclass in grace, intelligence, and quiet strength. What did he say that turned the table so dramatically? How did a young man, raised in the unrelenting glare of public scrutiny, manage to silence the critics in a way no one saw coming? Stay with us as we uncover the incredible moment that changed everything. This wasn't just about politics. This was about legacy, resilience, and the unshakable power of standing your ground. What happened next sent shockwaves through the media and left a lesson that no one would soon forget. From the moment Barron Trump was born, his life was anything but ordinary. Unlike most children who grew up shielded from the public eye, his every move was observed, his every appearance analyzed. He was not just the son of a billionaire businessman, but also the heir to a name that carried immense weight. Even before his father stepped onto the political stage, Barron had already been introduced to a world where cameras flashed in his direction, where headlines speculated about his future, and where every aspect of his upbringing was scrutinized. But nothing could have prepared him for what was to come. When Donald Trump announced his candidacy for the presidency, the Trump family was thrust into an entirely new level of exposure. Barron, still just a child, found himself at the center of a media frenzy unlike anything he had experienced before. Unlike other presidential children who were traditionally spared from the brutal attacks of the press, Barron was treated differently. The media, relentless in their pursuit to undermine his father, saw him as collateral damage. Every public appearance was dissected, every expression analyzed, every moment turned into a story designed to fit a larger narrative. But what they failed to understand was that Barron Trump was no ordinary child. He was raised in a household where resilience was not just encouraged, but required. From an early age, he had learned to navigate a world where strength was the currency of survival. He had watched his father face the most vicious attacks and yet emerge unshaken, more determined than ever. He understood that being a Trump meant standing firm in the face of adversity, refusing to be defined by the opinions of others. Unlike other children of world leaders who were carefully groomed for public life, Barron's childhood was different. He did not seek the spotlight, nor did he crave attention. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, a presence that set him apart. While other presidential children were often portrayed as symbols of innocence, Barron was seen as a mystery, an enigma who refused to conform to the expectations imposed upon him. Even as the media sought to frame him as distant or disconnected, those who truly paid attention saw something else. They saw a young man who possessed a deep understanding of the world around him, who listened more than he spoke, who absorbed rather than reacted. They saw someone who, despite his age, carried himself with a sense of purpose that was rarely seen in someone so young. And while critics tried to use his reserved nature against him, what they failed to realize was that silence was often more powerful than words. Barron had learned from the best. He had seen how his father commanded a room not just with what he said, but with how he carried himself. He understood that power was not just in speech, but in presence, in the ability to remain unshaken even when the world seemed determined to break you. As he grew older, it became clear that Barron Trump was not simply the son of a president. He was something more. He was a force waiting to be reckoned with, a young man who had been forged in the fire of relentless scrutiny and had emerged stronger because of it. And while the world continued to speculate about who he was and what he would become, one thing was certain: Barron Trump was not one to be underestimated. But what happened when the media finally pushed too far? When their relentless attacks reached a point where they could no longer be ignored? What did Barron Trump do that left even his harshest critics speechless? Stay with us, because the story is only just beginning. From the moment Barron Trump was born, Melania Trump made a decision. Her son would not be a tool for political narratives, nor would he be sacrificed to the relentless hunger of the media machine. Unlike many other first families who allowed their children to become figures of national curiosity, she was unwavering in her determination to protect Barron from the chaos that inevitably followed the Trump name. She had seen the way public scrutiny could shape and, in many cases, break young lives. She refused to let that happen to her son. Melania had always been known for her poise, her quiet yet commanding presence, and her ability to maintain control even in the most turbulent situations. That same level of composure extended to how she handled Barron's upbringing. She was not just a mother. She was his shield, the unwavering force that ensured he had as normal a childhood as possible, despite being born into one of the most publicized families in modern history. Even as Donald Trump's business empire grew and his influence extended beyond real estate into media and politics, Melania remained focused on a singular mission: giving Barron a sense of stability in a world where nothing was certain. When Donald Trump announced his candidacy for the presidency, Melania knew everything would change. Media was relentless. As Trump's campaign became one of the most polarizing and widely covered in history, they saw an opportunity. They had already exhausted every possible attack on Donald Trump himself, and now they turned their attention to his family. They questioned Barron's demeanor, speculated about his personality, and attempted to weave narratives that suited their own agendas. Some headlines were subtle, others were blatant, but all of them had the same underlying purpose: to use Barron as a means to criticize his father. Melania, however, was not one to stay silent. She understood the power of words, but more importantly, she understood the power of boundaries. She had spent years cultivating an image of grace and resilience, and when the moment came, she used that image to deliver a message that could not be ignored. She made a rare, public appeal, direct and firm, yet undeniably elegant. She called for the media to respect her son's privacy, reminding them that children should be off limits. It was not a plea, it was a declaration. She was not asking for kindness. She was demanding fairness. The impact was immediate. Some outlets took a step back, realizing they had overstepped. Others continued their pursuit, emboldened by the controversy. But Melania did not waver. She reinforced her stance through action, controlling Barron's appearances, ensuring that he was never unnecessarily exposed, and making it clear that there would be consequences for those who ignored her warning. She was strategic, calculated, and above all, unwavering in her role as a mother. But despite her efforts, the attacks persisted. Late-night television hosts, political commentators, and social media critics refused to let Barron remain just a child. They dissected his expressions, mocked his presence, and attempted to turn his existence into a punchline. It was a level of scrutiny that few presidential children had ever faced, and it only solidified Melania's resolve. She would not let them break her son. And then, as if the pressure had reached its peak, something happened, something that no one expected. Barron, the boy who had been kept away from the spotlight, the child whose mother had fought so hard to protect him, found himself at the center of an event that would change everything. What happened next was not just a moment of defiance, it was a moment that redefined the way the world saw him. As the media continued their relentless pursuit, they had unknowingly set the stage for something they could not control. The silence they had misinterpreted as weakness was about to be shattered, and when it happened, the world would not be able to look away. Barron Trump was about to step into a role no one had anticipated, and what he did next would leave an impact that could not be ignored. From the moment Donald Trump took office, his presidency was marked by a media war unlike anything seen before. Every decision he made, every policy he implemented, every statement he uttered was met with a relentless barrage of criticism from the press. His adversaries were determined to dismantle his legacy, to paint him as a villain in the eyes of the public, and to leave no stone unturned in their quest to diminish him. But as time went on, their attacks grew more insidious. They had exhausted every conceivable angle against him personally, so they sought a new target, one that would hurt him in a way no political scandal or policy debate ever could. They went after his son. Barron Trump, the youngest of Donald's children, had never sought attention. Unlike the children of previous presidents, he was rarely seen at public events, almost never spoke to the press, and had no political affiliations or public statements that could justify the scrutiny. And yet, the media treated him as fair game. Late-night television hosts, political commentators, and social media influencers, emboldened by their disdain for his father, saw no issue. In mocking a child who had done nothing but exist, the hypocrisy was glaring. The children of past presidents had been largely protected from public ridicule, regardless of their parents' political affiliations. When Barack Obama was in office, his daughters were shielded from scrutiny, rightfully spared from the harsh realities of political warfare. The same applied to Chelsea Clinton during her father's presidency. Even the children of George W. Bush, despite their moments of controversy, were ultimately recognized as off-limits by most of the mainstream media. But Barron Trump was given no such courtesy. He was not seen as a child. He was seen as an extension of his father, a tool to be used in their never-ending crusade against the Trump name. It began with subtle jabs, small remarks about his demeanor, his expressions, the way he carried himself during public appearances. They scrutinized his posture, his facial expressions, and even the way he dressed. Some media personalities speculated about his personality, making assumptions about his intelligence and upbringing, despite never having heard him speak publicly. Then, the attacks became more overt. A television writer, emboldened by the anonymity of social media, made a tasteless joke suggesting that Barron would become this country's first homeschool shooter. The backlash was swift, but the damage had already been done. The precedent had been set. Mocking Barron Trump was acceptable in a way it never had been for any other presidential child. Despite Melania Trump's public request for the media to respect Barron's privacy, the attacks persisted. They did not see him as a child who should be protected. They saw him as a symbol of the man they despised. Commentators openly discussed whether he was being raised properly, whether he was normal, whether his father's influence had affected him in ways that would shape his future. No proof was needed, no statements were necessary. Simply being a Trump was enough. But what the media failed to understand was that every attack, every insult, every mockery only strengthened the resolve of those who saw through their hypocrisy. While they believed they were eroding the Trump family's public image, they were instead building something far more powerful, a narrative of resilience, of unfair persecution, of a family that stood unbroken despite the relentless onslaught. They believed they were diminishing Barron Trump, but in reality, they were setting the stage for a moment they would come to regret. Because one day, the narrative would shift. The quiet boy they had ridiculed, the teenager they had dismissed as merely a shadow of his father, would find himself in a moment where silence was no longer an option. And when that moment came, the response would be something none of them had anticipated. The media had spent years defining Barron Trump without ever truly knowing him. But soon, they would. And when they did, they would realize that they had made a mistake, one that would change the way the world saw him forever. It was a press event, like many others before it, one of the countless moments where Donald Trump stood before the cameras, ready to face the barrage of questions that had become routine throughout his political career. The press room was filled with reporters, their eyes sharp, their pens ready, each waiting for their opportunity to craft the next headline that would dominate the news cycle. But this time, there was something different. This time, Barron Trump was there, standing silently by his father's side, observing, listening, taking in the scene with an expression that was difficult to read. The journalists knew this was a rare opportunity. Unlike the rest of Trump's children, Barron had remained mostly out of the spotlight, protected by his mother's careful planning and his own natural reserve. But today, for reasons unknown to them, he was present. And to the reporters in the room, that meant one thing, a chance to use him as a tool, as leverage to create a moment that would make headlines. They had spent years attacking Trump himself, but now, with Barron standing there, the rules had shifted. They saw an opportunity to strike deeper, to humiliate the former president in a way that went beyond politics. If they could make him falter in front of his own son, if they could push him into a moment of weakness with Barron watching, it would be more than just another media hit piece. It would be a spectacle. The first few questions followed the usual pattern: challenges to policies, demands for explanations, attempts to trap him in contradictions. Trump, as always, deflected them with the ease of someone who had been doing this for years. He countered their accusations, turned their questions back on them, leaving some of the reporters visibly frustrated. But then, someone in the crowd decided to take the moment further. A journalist, emboldened by the atmosphere, leaned forward, gripping the microphone tightly. There was a glint of satisfaction in their eyes, as if they had rehearsed this exact moment, waiting for the perfect time to unleash their attack. "Mr. Trump," the journalist began, voice laced with barely concealed disdain, "you've built your entire career on portraying yourself as strong, as a leader, as someone who never backs down. But what kind of example does that set for your son? Barron is standing right here watching. Doesn't he deserve a father who knows when to admit he's wrong? How does it feel to know that your legacy isn't one of leadership, but of division? Do you really want Barron to grow up seeing this version of you?" The room fell silent. The question wasn't just meant to challenge Trump. It was meant to humiliate him, to put doubt in his son's mind, to plant a seed that would linger beyond the press conference, beyond politics, beyond the moment. It was designed to strike at the very core of his identity, not just as a leader, but as a father. It was a calculated move, meant to elicit a reaction, to break the composure that Trump had mastered over decades of being in the public eye. For a brief second, there was no response. Barron, standing just a few feet away, turned slightly, his expression unreadable. The room was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Would Trump lash out as they expected? Would he ignore the question and move on? Would Barron himself react? But what no one realized in that moment was that they had made a crucial mistake. They had assumed that Barron was a passive observer, a silent figure who had no role to play other than to stand in the background. They had underestimated him. What they failed to understand was that Barron had spent his entire life watching his father face these exact moments. He had seen Trump endure every attack, every criticism, every attempt to tear him down, and he had learned. What happened next was not just unexpected, it was a turning point. It was the moment where everything the press had built against Trump began to crumble. But the person responsible for that shift was not the former president, it was Barron Trump. And in that moment, with the cameras rolling, the world would finally see exactly what he was capable of. For a brief moment, the room remained silent. The question had been asked, its weight heavy in the air, crafted with precision to inflict maximum damage. The journalist had expected an explosion of anger, a flustered denial, or even an awkward attempt to shift the narrative. What they had not anticipated was Barron Trump himself taking control of the moment. He stood there, still and composed, his expression unreadable. He had been watching, absorbing every word, every intention, behind the carefully placed attack. This was not the first time he had witnessed his father being cornered, not the first time he had seen the media attempt to dismantle the very essence of who Donald Trump was. But now, for the first time, the attack had been designed to reach him directly, to undermine the father in front of the son, to create doubt, to expose vulnerability. And yet, there was no hesitation, no flicker of uncertainty in his demeanor. Without waiting for his father to respond, Barron took a single step forward. It was not an act of defiance, not a show of aggression, but a deliberate motion that immediately shifted the energy in the room. The reporters, who just moments before had been eager to witness Donald Trump falter, now found themselves caught in the gaze of a young man they had underestimated. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and measured. There was no hesitation, no nervousness. The words came with an effortless confidence that carried more weight than any loud rebuttal ever could. "You assume I need to be told what kind of father I have," he said, his tone devoid of arrogance, yet filled with certainty. "But you forget that I've seen more than you ever will." The effect was immediate. The question, designed to create doubt, had instead been turned into an admission of ignorance. The journalist, who had moments before wielded control over the conversation, suddenly found himself exposed, not as an interrogator revealing truths, but as someone who had spoken without understanding, who had overplayed his hand. Barron did not stop there. His words were not fueled by emotion, not driven by defensiveness or anger, but by something far more powerful: clarity. Donald Trump's journey is filled with resilience, bold decisions, and unforgettable moments. Stay inspired, like this video, drop a comment below, and subscribe to be part of this movement. "You talk about legacy like it's something you get to define," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "But real legacy isn't measured by how people like you describe it. It's measured by what lasts, by what endures, by what still stands, even after years of attacks like this." A hush fell over the press room. The cameras were still rolling, capturing a moment that no one had expected, a moment that had shifted the power dynamic entirely. The media had believed they were shaping a narrative, that they had control over the story they were telling. But now, they were no longer the storytellers. There was no need for an outburst, no need for theatrics. Barron had disarmed them with something they did not know how to fight: poise. He had not given them sound bites to twist, had not reacted with the emotion they had hoped to provoke. He had simply spoken the truth, and in doing so, he had stripped their words of all their power. Donald Trump stood beside him, silent, watching. There was no need for him to interject. His son had done what no one in that room had expected. He had turned the entire moment into something that could not be spun, could not be reframed. The reporters, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, struggled to regain control, but it was too late. The moment had already taken on a life of its own. The footage would circulate, the words would be analyzed, and the realization would settle in. Barron Trump was no longer just a name in the background of his father's presidency. He had stepped forward not with force, but with a quiet strength that was impossible to ignore. And yet, this was only the beginning. The media had spent years crafting a version of him that suited their narrative, a silent, detached figure, merely existing in the shadow of his father. But now, that illusion had been shattered. What would they do now that the world had seen the truth? That Barron Trump was not just aware, but capable. That he was not a passive observer, but someone who understood exactly what was happening around him. The press conference continued, but the shift had already happened. A new chapter had begun, and this time it was not the media telling the story. It was Barron Trump himself. Donald Trump had faced countless battles in his lifetime. He had stood in boardrooms where billion-dollar deals hung in the balance. He had walked into political arenas where every word he spoke could shift the course of history. And he had withstood relentless attacks from the media, his opponents, and those who underestimated him. But at that moment, standing beside his son, he experienced something different, something deeper. He had always been a man who prided himself on strength, on resilience, on never backing down. And now, in front of the entire world, he saw that same unshakable fortitude reflected in Barron. For years, Trump had watched as his son navigated a world that had never truly given him a choice. Barron had been born into a legacy that came with expectations, scrutiny, and relentless public dissection. Unlike his older siblings, he had not yet had the chance to carve out his own path, to define himself outside of his father's shadow. And yet, in a single moment, with a few measured words, he had done just that. He had taken control of the narrative. He had turned an attack designed to humiliate into a demonstration of intelligence, poise, and power. Trump stood beside him, his expression firm but unreadable to those who did not know him well. But those who did, those who had been by his side in the most crucial moments of his career, recognized what was happening. This was not just the pride of a father watching his son step forward. This was the recognition of something far greater. Trump had spent decades proving that he was a man who could not be broken, who could not be defined by the words of those who sought to destroy him. And now, he was witnessing his son do the same. He could have let the moment pass. He could have let Barron's words stand on their own. But Trump was never one to waste an opportunity. And this was a moment that needed to be cemented in history. With the room still frozen in the aftermath of Barron's unexpected response, he stepped forward, his voice steady, his presence commanding. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need theatrics. He simply spoke the truth in the way only he could. They say legacy is about perception, he began, his gaze sweeping across the room, settling on the journalists who had moments ago believed they controlled the narrative. But real legacy isn't built on headlines. It's built on character, on standing tall when the world tries to tear you down, on knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone else define that for you. He gestured slightly toward Barron, not as a show of dominance, but as a clear acknowledgement of the moment that had just unfolded. I've spent my life fighting battles most people wouldn't survive. I've been underestimated, counted out, written off more times than I can count, and every single time I've proven them wrong. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Looks like my son has learned a thing or two. The statement was simple, but its impact was profound. It wasn't just a show of support, it was a passing of the torch. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that Barron had entered a different stage of his life, that he was no longer just a figure in the background of the Trump legacy, but a force in his own right. The journalists in the room, who had come prepared to capture a moment of weakness, now found themselves scrambling. The headlines they had envisioned were useless. The attempt to paint Trump as a man whose own son doubted him had crumbled before their eyes. Instead, they had inadvertently given The world, a rare glimpse into something that could not be spun, could not be reframed, a father's pride in his son, and a son's quiet but undeniable strength. Trump knew that this was only the beginning. The media would try to twist the story, to diminish what had just happened, to downplay the significance of Barron's words. But it didn't matter. The people watching had seen the truth with their own eyes, and truth had a way of spreading far beyond the walls of a press conference. As the event continued, as more questions were thrown his way, Trump handled them, as he always did, with confidence, with defiance, with the unwavering belief that he was always in control. But there was a difference now, a subtle shift in the energy of the room. The people in attendance weren't just looking at him anymore. They were looking at Barron. They were beginning to wonder if this was what he was capable of now, at this moment, at this age. What would he become in the years ahead? And that was the question that would linger long after the press conference ended. Because while Trump had spent decades fighting battles in the public eye, it was now clear that he was not the only one prepared to do so. The world had just witnessed the beginning of something new, and for the first time, those who had underestimated Barron Trump found themselves facing an unsettling realization. They had been so focused on bringing down the father that they had failed to see what was happening right in front of them. The sun was rising, and this was only the beginning. The moment Barron Trump calmly and confidently responded to the journalists' veiled attack, a ripple effect spread beyond the walls of the press conference. What had begun as a calculated attempt to humiliate his father had turned into an unexpected display of intelligence, grace, and resilience. And as the cameras continued rolling, capturing the stunned expressions in the room, something even more powerful was already in motion. Within minutes, the footage had begun to circulate across social media, reaching audiences far beyond the press room. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. On platforms that had long been divided over the Trump family, something rare happened: agreement. Regardless of political stance, people recognized that something significant had just taken place. The same journalists who had spent years crafting a narrative of Barron as a passive, detached figure were now scrambling to rewrite their own headlines, but it was too late. The internet had already seized control of the story. In the first hour alone, social media was flooded with reactions. Hashtags began trending at an unprecedented speed. Supporters of Donald Trump took to their accounts, celebrating what they saw as a defining moment for the youngest member of the Trump legacy. Prominent conservative voices who had long admired Trump's ability to dismantle the media's tactics were quick to praise Barron for his composure and sharp response. Barron Trump just proved that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The kid handled that question better than half the politicians in Washington. Incredible. That moment when the press thought they had the perfect trap, only for Barron to dismantle it in seconds. They'll never recover from this. Even those who had never openly supported Donald Trump found themselves acknowledging what had just happened. Independent commentators, many of whom had distanced themselves from mainstream narratives, took notice. Regardless of where you stand politically, that was impressive. Barron Trump just silenced an entire room of professional journalists with a few well-placed words. That takes intelligence and confidence beyond his years. But the impact didn't stop there. Video clips of the exchange spread like wildfire, with millions of views accumulating within hours. Conservative media outlets were the first to seize on the moment, running headlines that highlighted Barron's unexpected role in the event. The next Trump, Barron stuns the media with a response they didn't see coming. Like father, like son, Barron Trump takes control and humiliates reporters. The press tried to destroy Trump. His son destroyed them instead. Meanwhile, mainstream media outlets struggled to find a way to frame the event. Some attempted to downplay it, suggesting that the moment had been overblown by Trump supporters. Others went silent, realizing that any attempt to spin The exchange would only fuel its growing momentum. They had underestimated Barron for years, and now they found themselves in an unfamiliar position. They had no control over the narrative. On television, conservative pundits dissected every second of the footage. Some compared Barron's demeanor to that of his father, pointing out the same confidence and ability to turn a hostile situation in his favor. Others speculated about his future, wondering whether this was a sign of what was to come. Would Barron Trump follow in his father's footsteps? Would he one day step into the political arena, armed with the same defiance, the same unwavering belief in himself? But beyond the political implications, there was something even more striking about the reaction. People weren't just impressed by Barron's words, they were moved by the realization that despite years of being mocked, scrutinized, and underestimated, he had emerged as someone who could not only endure, but rise above. He had faced the full force of a media machine designed to break even the strongest of figures, and instead of buckling under the pressure, he had turned it into his own victory. And as the hours passed, as the momentum only grew stronger, a new question began to take shape. If Barron Trump could do this now, at this moment, with the world watching, what else was he capable of? What would he do next? The media had spent years trying to define him, but now they were no longer in control. For the first in time, Barron Trump had stepped out of the shadow of his father, and the world was finally paying attention. What they saw was not a boy being protected from the spotlight, but a young man who, when the moment called for it, had seized control of his own story. And that realization left people wondering, was this just an isolated moment, or was it the beginning of something far greater? One thing was certain, the media had miscalculated. They had thought they were setting a trap for Donald Trump. But in doing so, they had unleashed something they could never take back. And now, whether they liked it or not, Barron Trump's voice had been heard. The world was listening, and it would not forget. As the news of Barron Trump's response spread across the nation, it became more than just a viral moment. It became a rallying cry for those who had spent years watching the media unfairly target the Trump family. The sheer force of the public's reaction was unlike anything seen before. Social media, platforms, conservative talk shows, and independent news outlets all ignited with discussions, praise, and speculation about what had just transpired. It was no longer just a story about a young man standing up to the press. It was a symbol of resilience, of legacy, of a future that no one had predicted. The first wave of support came from the very people who had followed Donald Trump's journey from the beginning. Loyal supporters, many of whom had spent years defending the former president. Against relentless criticism, saw Barron's moment as proof that the strength of the Trump family was unbreakable. They flooded online platforms with messages of admiration and pride, drawing comparisons between Barron and his father. Donald Trump has spent his entire life fighting back against the establishment, and now we see that his son is cut from the same cloth. Barron Trump just showed America that he's got the same fire in him. This is just the beginning. If you ever wondered whether the Trump legacy would continue beyond Donald, you just got your answer. Barron didn't just respond, he owned that room. That level of confidence at his age? Watch out, because this kid is going places. Conservative political figures, many of whom had aligned themselves with Trump's vision, were quick to acknowledge Barron's unexpected moment of defiance. Senators, congressmen, and media personalities who had spent years pushing back against the mainstream narrative saw this as more than just a viral clip. It was a shift in perception. This is exactly why the media fears the Trump family, one well-known political commentator remarked during a live broadcast. They thought they could corner Donald Trump, humiliate him in front of his son, but what they didn't expect was for Barron to turn the tables. That wasn't just confidence, that was control. And when you see someone that young with that level of control, you realize that the Trump name isn't fading, it's evolving. Fox News and Other conservative outlets aired segments breaking down the moment, playing and replaying Barron's calm but piercing response. Pundits analyzed his tone, his body language, and most importantly, the impact of what he had said. Some went as far as to compare it to moments in history where young figures had stepped forward to define themselves under immense pressure. They pointed out that unlike the children of other presidents, Barron had never sought attention, had never used his father's name for political or personal gain, and yet, when the moment came, he had instinctively known how to take control of it. Think back to when Donald Trump was younger. A well-known conservative analyst commented, he was bold, unapologetic, fearless in how he confronted challenges. Now look at Barron. You can see the same instincts forming. He's learned from the best, and whether he realizes it or not, he just showed the world that he's got that same presence, that same ability to command attention with just a few words. But it wasn't just the mainstream conservative media that took notice. Figures from across the broader political spectrum, those who had once hesitated to fully align themselves with Trump, saw in Barron something undeniable: potential. A former White House strategist took to social media to express what many had begun to think. The Trump dynasty doesn't end with Donald. If Barron chooses to step into the arena in the future, he will do it with the advantage of having seen everything firsthand. He won't be learning the game, he will already know how it works. Others took a more symbolic approach, seeing Barron's unexpected stand as a testament to something deeper, the enduring nature of leadership passed from one generation to the next. Strength isn't taught, it's lived, one well-known conservative influencer posted. Barron Trump has lived through years of watching his father stand against impossible odds, and now we see the result. This is legacy in real time. As the support continued to pour in, the comparisons between Barron and Donald Trump as a young man became impossible to ignore. Those who had studied Trump's rise from a brash but brilliant businessman to a political powerhouse began to draw parallels. Trump had been underestimated in his early years, dismissed by critics as too bold, too unconventional, too unwilling to conform. And yet, he had defied them all, proving that the traits they mocked were the very ones that led to his success. Now, the same people who had once underestimated Trump found themselves facing an uncomfortable reality. They had just done the same thing to his son. But as history had already shown, underestimating a Trump was always a mistake. As the days passed, the conversation around Barron Trump only grew. Would he choose to remain out of the public eye? Or had this moment set him on a path no one had foreseen? The speculation was endless. But one thing had become clear. The media had spent years trying to paint a certain picture of Barron Trump, but in a matter of minutes, he had rewritten the entire narrative. And if this was just the beginning, what would come next? That was the question that no one could ignore. The press had expected to expose a weakness that day, but instead, they had revealed something far more dangerous: potential. And now, whether they liked it or not, the world was watching. The moment Barron Trump took control of the press conference with a measured, intelligent response, the media found itself in an unexpected predicament. The journalists who had sought to craft a narrative of weakness, of humiliation, of a father put in an uncomfortable position before his son, suddenly realized they had miscalculated. Instead of breaking Trump, they had elevated his son into something more than just a figure in the background. And yet, rather than acknowledge what had just happened, rather than report on the moment with the same intensity they would have given to any other political family, the media did what it did best. They manipulated, they downplayed, they attempted to rewrite history in real time. For years, the mainstream press had positioned itself as the guardian of fairness, claiming to protect the families of political figures from unnecessary attacks, arguing that children should be off limits. And yet, their treatment of Barron Trump had always stood in stark contrast to that supposed principle. The hypocrisy was impossible to ignore. When Barack Obama took office, His daughters were given the privacy they deserved. The media respected their childhood, avoided placing them in controversial headlines, and ensured that any discussion of their lives remained centered on their role as young members of a presidential family. Even Michelle Obama, in her various public speeches, reinforced that the press had been kind and protective, recognizing that children did not choose the political spotlight and should never be treated as extensions of their parents' legacies. The same could be said of the Biden family. The press largely avoided scrutiny of Hunter Biden's activities for years, dismissing allegations, refusing to investigate deeply, and even suppressing stories that might have harmed Joe Biden's political standing. The president's grandchild was barely mentioned in the press, and when the family itself made efforts to distance themselves from personal matters, the media complied without hesitation. There was a coordinated effort to shield, to protect, to ensure that the children of these presidents would not be dragged into the chaos of political warfare. But Barron Trump was never given that protection. From the moment his father stepped into the political arena, the rules changed. Late-night hosts made jokes at his expense, some so cruel that they sparked public backlash. Commentators speculated on his behavior, his demeanor, his presence at public events, crafting narratives about a boy who had never once spoken publicly. They mocked his height, his posture, even his expressions. Every minor detail became ammunition for those who sought to tear down his father. If the media had truly believed in their own moral code, in their own proclaimed standards, Barron Trump's moment of quiet strength should have been celebrated. It should have been seen as a remarkable display of maturity, a rare instance where the son of a former president had stepped forward with dignity and intelligence. Had it been the son of a Democrat, the headlines would have read differently. A young leader in the making, how, insert name, stood up for his father with poise and strength. The future of insert last name, how the next generation is already making an impact. A testament to good parenting, a moment that shows what real family values look like. Instead, what followed was a silence more deafening than any attack. Major news outlets refused to cover it, hesitant to acknowledge a reality they could not twist in their favor. Others attempted to diminish the significance of the moment, labeling it as overhyped or misinterpreted, as if the world had not just witnessed a striking moment of confidence from someone they had dismissed for years. But the public saw through the deception. Those who had watched the media's double standards unfold for years could no longer deny the obvious. The press had never truly believed in protecting children from political attacks. They had never actually stood for fairness. They had only protected those who served their interests, and when that protection was no longer convenient, they abandoned their own supposed principles without hesitation. Barron Trump's moment had done more than just showcase his own presence and intelligence. It had exposed something deeper, something that could no longer be ignored, the blatant, undeniable hypocrisy of the media. They had spent years attacking him, and when he finally stood his ground, they pretended it had never happened. But the world had already seen, the footage had already spread, the people had already made up their minds. And if the press thought this was the last time Barron Trump would leave them scrambling for control of the narrative, they were sorely mistaken. Because this was not the end. This was only the beginning. For years, Barron Trump had been seen as little more than a silent figure, standing in the background of one of the most scrutinized presidencies in modern history. He had been watched, speculated about, and often unfairly judged by those who had never even heard him speak. The world had crafted its own version of who he was, an observer, a shadow in the political storm that surrounded his father. But what they had never understood, what they had always underestimated, was that Barron was never just a son standing in the background. He was watching, learning, and preparing for a moment that no one saw coming. Unlike the children of past presidents, Barron was raised in an entirely different landscape. He was not born into the traditional political elite, nor was he carefully molded for public life in the way that so many presidential children had been before him. He did not grow up shaking hands at campaign rallies, nor was he paraded around for political advantage. Instead, his upbringing was marked by something far more intentional, a deliberate separation from the chaos, a protection that allowed him to develop away from the influence of the press, the public, and the expectations that would have otherwise shaped him into something he was never meant to be. His mother, Melania Trump, had ensured that his early years remained private, away from the media's grasp. His father, Donald Trump, had taught him something far more valuable than political strategy: how to endure, how to stand firm, how to recognize the game being played around him and never let it dictate his path. As the years passed, the world saw only glimpses of Barron. They saw the young boy who stood beside his parents at formal events, the teenager who towered over his father as they walked together, the quiet presence that seemed to exist outside the noise of political warfare. What they did not see, what they could never have predicted, was that Barron was not just growing up, he was becoming something more. Every great leader leaves a legacy. Be part of the conversation. Smash that like button, share your opinion in the comments, and make sure to subscribe for more powerful Trump insights. His education was unlike that of any other presidential child before him. He was fluent in multiple languages, a skill cultivated through Melania's insistence that he understand the world beyond the borders of America. His interests were vast, ranging from business to international affairs, from technology to economics. While most had assumed that he was merely another privileged heir to the Trump name, those who truly understood him knew better. He was not just inheriting a legacy, he was shaping his own. And then, as he stepped into adulthood, the world began to take notice. Barron was no longer just the youngest son of Donald Trump, he was a figure in his own right. His presence commanded attention, not because he sought it, but because it was impossible to ignore. His height, his demeanor, the way he carried himself with an effortless confidence that mirrored his father's, all of it combined to create something undeniable. He had the aura of someone who was destined for something greater, someone who, despite having been underestimated for years, had always understood exactly where he was headed. Political analysts, once dismissive of his relevance, began to shift their tone. They speculated on his future, questioning whether he would follow in the footsteps of his father or forge a new path entirely. Some believed he would step into the world of business, continuing the Trump empire in a way that only someone raised in its very core could. Others whispered about the possibility of something far more significant, that Barron Trump, with his unique combination of intelligence, presence, and quiet strength, could one day enter the political arena himself. And while the world debated, while the media attempted to once again craft a narrative around him, Barron remained, as he always had, unmoved, unshaken, completely aware of the power he held simply by existing. He did not need to announce his plans. He did not need to seek validation. He had already proven, in a single moment of calculated precision, that when the time came he would not be ignored, because Barron Trump was never just a child growing up in the White House. He was never just a son standing in the shadow of a political giant. He was something far more powerful, a figure who had been forged in the fire of scrutiny, who had been underestimated by those who failed to see what was right in front of them. And if this was only the beginning, then the question, no longer, was whether Barron Trump would one day take his place on the world stage. The question was how long the world had before it happened. Barron Trump had spent his entire life under the weight of a name that commanded attention. From the moment he was born, he was linked to a legacy that had shaped business, politics, and culture in ways that few families ever had. And yet, for years, he remained an enigma. The world saw only fragments of him. A quiet figure standing beside his father, towering presence that moved through public life without speaking a single word. But as he grew, as the years passed and the political landscape shifted, the question that had once seemed distant and speculative began to take on new weight. Could Barron Trump one day step into the political arena? And if he did, what would that mean for the future? The speculation was inevitable. His father had changed the very fabric of American politics, rewriting the rules, challenging institutions, and proving that the system was not as impenetrable as many had believed. He had taken on the media, the political elite, and the global establishment, all while building a movement that remained as strong as ever. For years, political analysts and historians had debated whether Donald Trump was a singular phenomenon or if his influence would extend beyond his time in office. The answer to that question, many now believed, lay not in his own continued presence, but in the one who had stood beside him, watching, learning, and preparing in silence. Barron Trump had never expressed any political ambition publicly. He had never made grand statements about his future, never given the press a soundbite to analyze, never indulged in the speculation that surrounded him. But that silence, rather than diminishing interest, only fueled it, because those who understood politics knew that the most dangerous figures were often the ones who spoke the least. And if there was one thing Barron Trump had proven, it was that when he did choose to speak, the world listened. The comparisons were inevitable. His father had entered politics as an outsider, a businessman who defied every expectation and dismantled decades of political norms. Barron, should he choose to follow that path, would enter with something even more powerful, a name that had already changed history and a first-hand understanding of exactly how the system worked. He had witnessed every political maneuver, every strategy, every battle fought and won. Unlike his father, who had entered the arena as a disruptor from the outside, Barron would step into it as someone who already knew its inner workings. Some dismissed the idea entirely, arguing that Barron had been deliberately shielded from politics and would choose a life outside of it. But those who had paid closer attention saw something different. They saw a young man whose presence commanded attention, who carried himself with a quiet confidence that echoed the same natural authority his father had possessed long before he ever stepped onto a debate stage. They saw someone who had been raised in the heart of power, who had learned the art of negotiation, of strategy, of influence, not from books or political mentors, but from the very man who had redefined modern leadership. The political landscape was shifting, and those who sought to shape the future understood that the Trump name was not fading, it was evolving. The movement that had propelled Donald Trump to power was not just about one man, it was about an ideology, a belief in strength, in leadership, in challenging the status quo. And should Barron Trump ever decide to step forward, he would not be starting from nothing. He would be stepping onto a foundation that had already been built, with a base that had proven its loyalty and resilience through every storm. The question now was not whether Barron Trump could enter politics, but what would happen if he did. Would he carry forward his father's legacy, refining and expanding it into something even greater? Would he take the lessons learned from a lifetime of observation and apply them in ways that no one could predict? Would he remain in the background, waiting for the right moment, until the world was forced to acknowledge that he was not just a bystander to history, but a player in its making? Speculation would continue to swirl, theories would continue to be debated, and the media would continue to wonder. But there was one undeniable truth. Barron Trump had already proven that he was not to be underestimated, and if history had taught anything, it was that those who dismissed the Trumps always lived to regret it. Because if Barron Trump ever chose to step onto the political stage, it would not just be another campaign, it would be an event that would reshape the political order itself, and those who had spent years underestimating him would realize too late that they had made the same mistake the world had made. With his father, They had ignored the warning signs, overlooked the quiet intelligence, dismissed the presence that had been there all along, and by the time they realized what was happening, Barron Trump would already be redefining the future. From the very beginning, Donald Trump understood that raising a son under the weight of his name would be unlike anything most fathers ever experienced. His own life had been built on resilience, on an unbreakable will to defy expectations and carve out a legacy that no one could erase. He had fought battles in boardrooms, on political stages, and in the relentless court of public opinion. But none of those battles mattered as much as the one that was never televised. The battle to raise his youngest son to be strong enough to endure the world he would inevitably face. Barron Trump was born into a family where strength was not optional. It was a requirement. His father had built an empire through sheer force of will, overcoming obstacles that would have broken lesser men. His siblings had followed in those footsteps, each in their own way, proving that they could handle the pressure that came with the Trump name. But Barron's upbringing was different. He was not just being raised in the shadow of a powerful businessman. He was being raised in the center of one of the most polarizing presidencies in history. Donald Trump knew what the world would throw at his son before Barron was even old enough to understand it himself. He had seen how the media operated, how they built and destroyed people with equal efficiency, how they created narratives not based on truth, but on the needs of their agenda. He knew they would attack Barron, not because of who he was, but because of who his father was. And so, from an early age, Trump instilled in him a lesson that had carried him through every challenge he had ever faced. Never let them define you. Barron was not raised to seek approval. He was not taught to chase validation from those who would never give it to him. Instead, he was raised to understand power, to recognize when it was being used against him, and to never surrender control of his own narrative. Trump did not sugarcoat the realities of the world. He prepared Barron for them. He did not teach his son to avoid criticism. He taught him to be indifferent to it. He did not teach him to change for the sake of acceptance. He taught him that true strength comes from standing firm even when the entire world tries to push you down. Unlike the children of other political figures, Barron was never molded into a media-friendly image. He was never placed in front of cameras for carefully curated photo ops, never made to parrot scripted lines designed to make his father look good. Instead, he was given something far more valuable, the freedom to develop his own sense of identity, to become his own man, unshaken by the expectations that others tried to impose on him. But Trump's influence on Barron was not just about toughness. It was about understanding. He knew that in order to truly navigate the world, his son needed more than just resilience. He needed intelligence. And so, Trump ensured that Barron's education was rigorous, that he was exposed to the complexities of business, politics, and global affairs from an early age. He did not speak to him as a child, but as a future leader. He did not shield him from reality, but instead equipped him with the tools to face it head-on. Over time, those lessons began to show. The world saw only glimpses of Barron, but those who paid attention noticed the details, the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence, the refusal to engage in petty distractions. He was never a child seeking to prove himself, never someone who needed to respond to the noise surrounding him, because he had already learned the most important lesson his father could teach him. Power is not in how loud you are, but in how unshaken you remain. The media had spent years trying to frame Barron as either a victim or an outsider, assuming that the relentless attacks on his family would weigh him down. But what they never realized was that those very attacks had only reinforced everything his father had taught him. Every insult, every attempt to diminish his presence, every unfair scrutiny had done nothing but strengthen him. They had not broken him. They had prepared him. Now, as he stepped into adulthood, the question was no longer whether Barron could withstand the pressure that came with being a Trump. The question was what he would do with the strength he had been given. Would he follow in his father's footsteps, using the lessons of resilience and leadership to forge his own path? Or would he take what he had learned and apply it in ways that no one expected? One thing was certain: the world had underestimated Donald Trump once before, and it had paid the price for that mistake. Now, as Barron Trump stood on the horizon of his own future, those who had spent years dismissing him would soon come to realize that they had made the same mistake again, because Trump had not just raised a son, he had raised a force. And when the time came for Barron to step forward, the world would understand exactly what that meant. The media had made a fatal mistake once before. They had underestimated Donald Trump, believing that he was nothing more than a celebrity businessman, an outsider who would crumble under the weight of political scrutiny. They had believed that the relentless attacks, the coordinated efforts to dismantle his reputation, and the never-ending storm of accusations would eventually break him. But they were wrong. He had not only survived their onslaught, he had thrived in it. He had taken their criticism, their hostility, and their desperate attempts to destroy him and turn them into fuel. He had built an empire long before he entered politics. But after stepping into the arena, he had built something even more formidable. A movement, one that could not be erased by headlines or dismissed by pundits. Now, as Barron Trump emerged from the shadows, as he stepped into the public consciousness in a way that no one had anticipated, the media found itself facing a familiar dilemma. What they had once ignored, what they had treated as an afterthought, was now a force they could no longer overlook. The youngest Trump, the one they had assumed would remain silent, had proven himself to be something they never expected. A presence that could not be controlled, a name that carried weight beyond what they had predicted. And that meant only one thing: they would try again. The media would not admit their mistake. They never did. Instead, they would regroup. They would shift their strategy, recalibrate their approach, and prepare for a new line of attack. They had spent years crafting a specific image of Barron Trump, a distant, indifferent figure who remained outside the political battlefield. That image had served them well, allowing them to avoid acknowledging him as anything more than a footnote in his father's legacy. But that illusion had shattered the moment Barron had spoken, the moment he had turned their own tactics against them with a quiet, unwavering strength that echoed his father's. Now they would need a new narrative. Some would attempt to diminish him. They would say that his presence was irrelevant, that he was nothing more than a product of his father's influence, lacking any real identity of his own. They would claim that any attention he received was orchestrated, that any demonstration of intelligence or confidence was merely a reflection of the environment he had been raised in. They would seek to strip him of his individuality, to make it seem as though he was nothing more than an extension of Donald Trump, rather than a force in his own right. Others would take a different approach. They would attempt to vilify him. They would dig through every moment of his life, searching for something, anything, that could be used to cast doubt on his character. They would analyze his education, his social circles, his personal interests, looking for a flaw they could exploit. They would attempt to create controversy where none existed, to frame him as a potential threat before he had even declared an intention to step into the political arena. And if all else failed, they would try to use him as a weapon against his own family. They would push the narrative that he was different from his father, that he did not share the same ideology or ambitions. They would attempt to divide, to create a wedge between him and the Trump legacy, hoping that even the mere suggestion of distance would weaken the image of strength that had defined the family for years. But what they failed to understand, what they had always failed to understand, was that the Trumps did not break under pressure. They adapted, they anticipated, they prepared. Donald Trump had spent his life in the trenches of media warfare, and he knew better than anyone what would come next. He had been through every possible attack, every attempt to dismantle his reputation, every coordinated effort to turn public perception against him. And because of that, He understood exactly how to protect Barron from the same fate. The Trump family would not allow the media to dictate the terms of Barron's public presence. They would control the narrative, choosing carefully when and how he stepped into the spotlight. They would ensure that every public appearance, every statement, every carefully planned moment was designed not to play into the media's game, but to rewrite the rules entirely. They would surround Barron with the same unshakable fortress that had protected them for years. He would not be left vulnerable to attacks disguised as concern or analysis. His presence would be a deliberate choice, his words spoken with intention, his actions never dictated by outside forces. But more than anything, they would allow him to grow into his own power. Because the greatest weapon against the media's relentless attacks was not just defense, it was dominance. Barron had already shown that he possessed the ability to turn their tactics against them. He had already demonstrated that he understood the rules of engagement, that he knew when to strike and when to remain silent. And if history had taught anything, it was that when a Trump remained silent, it was not out of fear, it was out of strategy. The media would try again, they always did. But this time they would not be dealing with an unknown figure. They would not be crafting a narrative about someone they believed they could control. They would be facing someone who had been raised in the very heart of the battle. And when the time came, when the next attack was launched, when the headlines once again attempted to define him, Barron Trump would be ready, because the world had seen only a glimpse of what he was capable of. And the media had already made the mistake of underestimating him once. They would not be so fortunate a second time. For years, the American people had watched as the media dictated narratives, controlled conversations, and determined the reputations of those who dared to challenge the establishment. They had seen careers destroyed, leaders vilified, and movements silenced, all at the hands of a system designed to maintain its own power. And yet, no matter how relentless the attacks, no matter how coordinated the efforts to suppress dissent, something had always remained constant. Those who refused to bow, those who stood their ground, those who understood that real power came not from appeasing the media, but from defying it. Donald Trump had been the embodiment of that defiance. He had taken on an entire political and media empire, exposing its hypocrisy, its corruption, its blatant disregard for the truth. He had faced attacks that would have broken lesser men, yet he had never surrendered, never wavered, never given them the satisfaction of seeing him retreat. He had fought because he believed in something greater, because he understood that the power of the American people could never truly be controlled as long as they refused to submit. Now, as Barron Trump emerged into the public eye, the world saw that same defiance, that same resilience, that same ability to turn attacks into opportunities. He had been raised in the fire of public scrutiny, had watched the media attempt to destroy his father, had seen firsthand how narratives were manufactured to shape perception. And yet, when the moment came for them to attack him, to try and define him before he had even stepped forward, he did not run. He did not shrink. He did not allow them to dictate his identity. He did what his father had always done. He stood his ground. And if Barron Trump, a young man who had spent his entire life under the most intense public microscope, could do that, if he could face the full force of a media empire designed to break him and emerge stronger, then what excuse did anyone else have? The message was clear. The battle for truth, for integrity, for the right to speak and think freely was not just the responsibility of one man or one family. It belonged to every patriot who refused to be silenced, to every individual who recognized the lies being pushed upon them and chose to question, to resist, to push back. The media had spent years telling people what to believe, convincing them that they were powerless against the machine. But the truth was, they had never been powerless. The system only held authority over those who allowed it to. The legacy of Donald Trump was not just about politics. It was about courage. It was about refusing to conform, refusing to accept the narratives handed down by those who had no real stake in the well-being of the country. It was about standing firm, even when the weight of the world seemed to push back. And now, that legacy continued through Barron, not because he had sought it, but because he had been forged in it. This was the moment for every patriot to take a lesson from the Trumps, not just to watch, not just to admire, but to act, to refuse to be manipulated, to reject the lies, to understand that no headline, no media attack, no coordinated smear campaign could ever hold power over someone who knew who they were and refused to be defined by anyone else. The battle for truth was far from over. The media would continue their attempts to control, to suppress, to dictate the terms of public discourse. But they had already made their biggest mistake. They had assumed that their power was absolute. They had believed that they could define Barron Trump just as they had attempted to define his father. They were wrong, and now the question was no longer whether the American people could fight back. The question was whether they were ready to embrace that fight, to recognize that they had never been as powerless as they had been told. Because if Barron Trump could stand against them, so could they. And when enough people chose to stand, the media would no longer hold the power they once did. The future belonged to those who refused to be controlled, and that future had already begun. Barron Trump had never asked for the spotlight, yet when the moment arrived, he stood in it without hesitation. He had been raised in the eye of the storm, shaped by a world that had never granted him the luxury of anonymity. From the moment his father stepped onto the political battlefield, Barron had been a target, not for his actions, not for his words, but simply for the name he carried. And yet, through it all, he had remained composed, unshaken, and quietly observing a world that had already decided who he was before he had spoken a single word. But when the time came, when the media turned its gaze upon him in an attempt to control the narrative, he did not fold. He did not react with anger, nor did he allow himself to be defined by the expectations of others. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He answered with confidence, with intelligence, with a presence that caught even the most seasoned journalists off guard. In a single moment, he transformed from a background figure into a force that could no longer be ignored. His response was not just a defense of his father. It was a statement of his own strength, a declaration that he understood exactly what was happening around him and that he would not be manipulated. It was a reminder to everyone watching that true power does not come from media approval or political favor. It comes from knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone else define that for you. The impact of that moment did not fade. The footage spread, the headlines were rewritten, and those who had once dismissed Barron as nothing more than the son of a former president were forced to reconsider. Was this simply an isolated instance? Or was it the beginning of something greater? Was Barron Trump destined to remain in the shadows, or had he just taken his first steps towards something far beyond what anyone had expected? That is the question now left to history. Could Barron Trump follow in his father's footsteps, not just as a figure within the Trump legacy, but as a leader in his own right? Could he take the lessons of strength, resilience, and defiance that had been instilled in him from birth and forge his own path? The media will continue to speculate. The critics will continue to doubt. But those who witnessed that moment, those who saw the quiet confidence, the sharp mind, the ability to turn an attack into an opportunity, know that the future holds more than what has been predicted. And now, the question is no longer whether Barron Trump will rise. The question is whether the world is ready for it when he does. Do you believe Barron Trump has what it takes to be a leader in the future? Do you see the potential for something greater? Share your thoughts, spread the message, and let the world know that this is only the beginning. Because history is not written by those who sit silently. It is written by those who stand, who speak, and who refuse to be controlled. And Barron Trump has already proven that he is ready. Are you? Strength, strategy, and vision. If these qualities inspire you, you're in the right place. Show your support by liking this video, commenting your thoughts, and subscribing for more.